I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on figurative language. All right, so this is our grade 7 English lesson on figurative language. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 7. All right. So we have figurative language, right? Then we need to select the subject of language arts, grade 7. Then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of figurative language, right? And we said the chapter is figurative language, English, which is language arts, grade 7. And the lessons that we're going to be focusing on today under the chapter of figurative language is to classify figure of speech and also to interpret figure of speech. So we're going to classify figure of speech and interpret figure of speech. All right. All right. So when it comes to, let's say, figurative language, right? Figure of speech, right, are words or phrases that use language as a non-literal or in an unusual way, right? It's not literal. It's not like I'm saying that your jacket is dirty. I'm saying it in a more figurative way, right? It's like I'm expressing it more, but I am expressing it in a not directly in a literal way, right? Like we are saying love is in the air. It's like a figure of speech, right? It's figurative. It's not a literal thing where we are showing that love is floating in the air, all right? That is just an example that I could think of now. All right. Then we have, and when it comes to figure of speech, right? Figures of speech, they make writing more expressive, right? It's like me expressing myself through the type of language that I'm using, right? Then we have alliteration, right? We have alliteration. And alliteration is the repetition of sound at the beginning of nearby words. So it is the repetition of sound, repeating sounds, right, at the beginning of nearby words. All right. And an example of alliteration, sorry, and an example of alliteration is what a lucky little lady you are. It is the repeating of sound of lucky little lady, right? That is a repeating of sound with the l's, lucky little lady, right? That is alliteration. It's a repetition of sound and it is at the beginning of nearby words. All right. Then we have an allusion, right? And an allusion is a brief reference of something or someone well known. And often, usually, it's from history or from literature, right? And that's an allusion. It's a brief reference to someone or to something that is well known. And like we say, it's often either from history or from literature. And an example is, right, I'd better get home before I turn into a pumpkin, Leela remarked. And if we look at, let's say, this expression, right, before I turn into a pumpkin, then it is related to those storybooks of many years ago. I think it's the Cinderella story, where they say if she don't get home before a certain time, and then basically all her the carriage, the let's say literally everything around her turn back into either a pumpkin, back into the mouse or the mice, right? So I'd better get home before I turn into a pumpkin. That is some form of expression that is being used. And that expression is being used, right, based on literature or on history that we have read already. That's an illusion. Then we have an idiom, right? And an idiom is an expression, right, that cannot be understood literally, right? It's an expression that we cannot be understood literally. It is not a literal meaning, right? And when it comes to an idiom, right, you need to basically it's like the meaning of that idiom, it needs to be learned. Because we cannot directly translate what an idiom means. It's an expression that you cannot directly translate, right? Because it does not mean directly based on what it basically says. It's like saying the Simon is a piece of cake, right? It doesn't mean that the Simon is a piece of chocolate cake or piece of vanilla cake or piece of red velvet cake or carrot cake. No, it's not directly meaning, it does not directly mean a piece of cake, right? That we eat. It's like saying the Simon was, it was easy. That is what they mean when they say a piece of cake. All right. So once again, an idiom is an expression, right, that we cannot use literal. You need to learn the meaning. You cannot directly translate what that specific idiom means. And we made an example of a piece of cake, right? The assignment was a piece of cake. It's like saying this assignment was easy. You can't say the assignment was a slice of cake, right? It's nothing to do with cake, nothing to do with piece of cake, right? It just means that the assignment was easy. Then we have a simile. And a simile, it uses words like or as to compare two things that are not actually alike. So we use words like, or we use words like as, and that is to compare things that are not actually alike. And once again, it's a figurative expression. It doesn't mean literal. For example, the cat's fur was as dark as. There we have the as dark as the night. Right? It just means that the cat's fur is can be black or it's a darker color, right? But now they're comparing the cat's fur to the darkness at night, right? So remember the night is dark, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the cat's fur is anything to do with the darkness of the night, right? Then we have a metaphor, right? A metaphor. And a metaphor, it compares two things that are not actually alike without using words like or as. It's a metaphor. And an example of a metaphor is the snow formed a blanket over the town. The snow formed a blanket over the town. And once again, this expression is also not literal, it is a figurative expression. Because if we look at that sentence, it says the snow formed a blanket over the town. We cannot just say that it is to do with an actual blanket that we threw over the town, right? It just means that with all the snowing that took place, right? It basically, let's say there was a lot of snow that took place, and it basically covered the whole of the town. All right, and then we have another word. Look at this word. Look at this word. We have the word onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia, right? And onomatopoeia, right, it involves using a word that expresses a sound. It expresses a sound, right? It says the scrambled eggs hit the floor with a splat, right? So now, which means that you are now trying to describe something that took place by also using sound. It's like saying the bang of the drum, or the sound of the drum went bang, right? Or you can say that somebody scratched on the window and it was a screech sound. So that is onomatopoeia. It is involves using a word that expresses a sound. right? It expresses a sound. All right, and then we have personification, right? Personification. And personification is giving human characteristics to non human things, right? So it's like giving human characteristics to non human things. For example, the trees danced in the wind, right? So, depending on how the wind is blowing, so now the trees are moving from side to side. But now they're trying to give a human characteristic to this tree, right? By saying that the trees danced in the wind, right? Because the trees are moving in the wind. All right, and that is personification. It is giving human characteristics to a non human thing or two non human things, right? And we made an example of the trees danced in the wind. All right, then we have a pun. A pun. And a pun involves using a word or phrase in a humorous way that suggests more than one meaning. It involves using a word or phrase in a humorous way that suggests more than one meaning. So we have a pun, and a pun involves using a word or phrase in a humorous way, right? It's like me saying something and I'm more laughing about it, right? And that word, it is used in a humorous way that suggests more than one meaning. For example, a great new broom is sweeping the nation. Is this actual broom sweeping the whole of the country, the whole of the nation, the whole of the world? No, right? But we are using this word in a figurative expression, right? That suggests humor or it brings about humor. So once again, we see the pun involves using a word or phrase in a humorous way that suggests more than one meaning. A great new broom is sweeping the nation, right? And that is a figurative expression, not literal. And then lastly, right, we have verbal irony. So we have an irony, but we have a verbal irony. And remember, verbal means to talk, right? Using your words, word of mouth. So verbal irony, it involves saying one thing, you see, saying one thing but implying something very different. So people often use verbal irony when they're being sarcastic, right? So verbal irony, it involves something one a saying it involves saying one thing but implying something very different, right? And people often use verbal ironies when they are being sarcastic. All right. And if we look at an example of a verbal irony, right, it says Olivia seemed thrilled that her car keeps breaking down, which means that each breakdown is as enjoyable as a punch to the face. Right? All right. So now we're going on to our let's go on to our test. And that is where we're either going to say is it verbal irony, onomatopoeia, is it a pun, a personification, right? We're going to use one of those words or figure of speeches to say what the answer is. Which figure of speech is used within this text? All right. Which figure of speech is used within the text? Right? It says the metal platter landed with great clang, spraying bits of food across the kitchen floor and cabinets. It says the metal platter landed with a great clang, to do with sound, clang, spraying bits of food across the kitchen floor and cabinets. Is it onomatopoeia or a verbal irony? All right. Remember, we said a verbal irony is where we are basically just, it's like you're saying something, in a more expressive way. Whereas an onomatopoeia is to do with sound, right? And here they say the metal platter landed with a great clang, spraying bits of food across the floor and cabinets, right? So if we were to choose the correct one, and then we will say it is an onomatopoeia because it's to do with sound, right? It is to do with sound. Remember, we said Yes, yes, beautiful. It is onomatopoeia because remember they said that it expresses a specific sound. Like if we were to say it made a bang sound or a banging sound, then we would have also said it's onomatopoeia or a screech onomatopoeia, right? I was just beginning to yawn with nerves when I knew his tat at the door. Like a sound tat. So probably a gun. I don't know what is a tat, but it's like a sound. I was just beginning to yawn with nerves, right? When I knew he's tat at the door. Is that a onomatopoeia or a simile? To do with sound. All right. And if we choose the correct one, then we'll go with an onomatopoeia. This is going tat. It's like a sound that we can hear. It's almost like making a gun sound, like a some is it a rifle or something sound. Albert remarked that the new book of anti-gravity was impossible to put down. Albert remarked that the new book of anti-gravity was impossible to put down. Is this a pun or is this an alliteration? All right, and we need to choose between either is this a pun or is this an alliteration? Albert remarked that the new book of anti-gravity was impossible to put down. Is a pun or alliteration? All right, then if we were to choose the correct one, right, we can say that this is a pun. All right, now it says, let the rain kiss you. So let the rain kiss you. Is that a personification or is that a verbal irony? Personification or a verbal irony? And remember, personification is when we are attributes of a person of nature into a human characteristics, non-human things. Or is it a verbal irony? A verbal irony is when someone says something which is different than what they mean. All right, let's go with personification, right? It's human like. Because does the rain kiss us? No, it's just the droplet that is touching our face. It doesn't necessarily mean that the rain is kissing us. So well done. Option one was correct. Well done, or is correct. Then, which figure of speech is used within this text? From forth the fatal loins of these two foes. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes. A pair of a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Is this alliteration or is this a pun? From forth the fatal loins of these two foes. A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Is this alliteration or a pun? So alliteration or a pun. Forth the fatal. From forth the fatal. Let's quickly see. I think from forth the fatal. Yes, it's alliteration. That word, the ifs. From forth the fatal. It's that ifs, that alliteration, the sound, like the beginning of the word, right? All right. Which figure of speech is used within the sticks? It says, hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells, how they tickle, tickle, tickle in the icy air of night. Is this onomatopoeia or once again a verbal irony? Onomatopoeia or verbal irony when it tickle, tickle, tickle sound. All right, and if we choose the correct one or the correct figure of speech, then we can say it's an onomatopoeia. It's to do with the sound. It shows or tells us that the sledges, it goes tickle, tickle, tickle. All right, so now we're going to interpret the figure of speech, right? And once again, we said figures of speech, right, are words or phrases that use language in a non literal or unusual way, right? And they make writing more expressive. We said a metaphor compares two things that are not actually alike, and we don't use words like or as, right? Similes, we use words like or as, but not a metaphor. For example, the snow formed a blanket over the town. So that is a metaphor and it's comparing two things that are actually not alike, right? Without using the word like or as. So which means that the metaphor ideas of food So if we look at this, the sentence that says he reads in ooh, what is the word, incessantly mm. New ideas of food for his mind, which means that that is a metaphor, right? It suggests that he is stimulated by new ideas. He reads incessantly. Is it incessantly? New ideas of food for his mind. It's not directly meaning we are talking about food that, you know, we need to feed the mind with the food. No, right? It's meaning that he is being stimulated by the new ideas. So food energizes the body, but the mind or the ideas that energize the mind. Right? And then we have verbal irony, and we said it involves in saying one thing but implying something different. And people often use verbal irony when they are being sarcastic. Right? All right, let's go to our test. What does the verbal irony within this text mean? It says this salsa could use a little more spice. Mitchell said as he gulped down water and wiped tears from his eyes. So it's like being sarcastic. Is he saying that the salsa was too spicy or the salsa was tasteless? So this salsa could use a little more spice, right? Could use a little more spice. Mitchell said as he gulped down water and wiped tears from his eyes. So he's being sarcastic. Does it mean that the salsa was too spicy, especially since he's been gulping the water? Or does it mean that the salsa was tasteless? All right, so we can then say that the salsa was too spicy, but he is just being sarcastic, right? What does the verbal irony mean? Right? It says, this is the best day of my life. Mr. Simon mumbled after his car broke down on the way to an important job interview. And I'm sure he's like saying, oh, this is the best day of my life. Does that mean Mr. Simon was having a bad day? Or does it mean that Mr. Simon liked fixing cars? What does it mean? Option one or option two? Do you actually think that he is having the best day of his life? Because I don't think so if his car breaks down on his way to an interview, which means that he's gonna miss the interview and not get the job. All right, so this is the best day of my life, right? Which means that Mr. Simon was having a very, very bad day, right? He was having a bad day because his car broke down on the way to an interview. All right, what does the metaphor within this text mean? A metaphor, all right? Sarah felt a roller coaster of emotions when she heard the news. Sarah felt a roller coaster of emotions when she heard the news. Does it mean that Sarah found the news scary or Sarah had varied feelings? All right, so does it mean that Sarah felt a roller coaster of emotions when she heard the news? Does that mean that Sarah found the news scary or she had varied feelings about this news? All right, and if we choose the correct one, all right, let's go with the second one. All right, she's feeling a varied of feelings, yes, of emotions, right? Because she's sad, right? It's like a ball of emotions that she's feeling. All right, let's do the last one. It says, what does the personification in this text suggest? The personification in this text suggest, right? Human like. While the plumber was under the sink fiddling with the pipes, the drain burped up a spray of brown water. Does it mean that the drain noisily released some water or the plumber burped? What is the correct answer? The drain noisily released some water or the plumber burped? All right, so it says while the plumber was under the sink fiddling with the pipes, the drain burped up a spray of brown water, right? And if we choose the correct one, we will say it's because the drain noisily released some water, not the plumber burping, right? All right, so that is the end of our lesson on figurative languages, right? And we see the figure of speeches are words and phrases that use languages in a non-literal or unusual way. They can basically be written. It's like when we write, it's like we are showing much more expression, right? All right, so this is now the end of our lesson, grade 7 on figurative language. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I really hope you're going to have a good evening further. Goodbye.